Now, some sad news today that former Saints player and manager Chris Nicholl has passed away. The 77-year-old former centre-back made 228 appearances for Saints. He was the manager from 1985 to 1991, giving many Saints supporters some great memories. For me, manager for my first visit to the Dell. Glen, you remember him as a player?
I do. I remember us signing him in, I think it was 1977. It was after the cup final, and Lauren McMenemy kind of instigated this policy. We kind of had this policy anyway, but we were signing players who were seen as over the hill by everybody else, and the idea was to get a couple more years out of them and make the most out of their experience. And what we got with Chris Nicholl was, I think he was about 30. He was a Northern Ireland international, which back then was a big deal. You know, we had the home international championships, and you know, it was a big deal to sign a player who was, you know, we were in Division 2, as was the Championship now. To sign an international player was a big deal, and we got promoted in his first season, and he stayed for a further 5 years after that. I think the last one was very injury interrupted when he was 35, 36. But for 4 or 5 years, he, as we established ourselves in the top division, he was a mainstay of the defence. Particularly remember a partnership in Division 1 with Dave Watson, who was a similarly aged England international. And they were, you know, the pair of them were a bit slow. They were just solid, old school, solid, and they did a brilliant job for us, considering we were a very attacking team. So they were kind of left isolated a fair amount. And he's a player that I remember very sort of like fondly from my early days of watching Saints at the Dell. And yeah, it's you know, I mentioned Dave Watson and along with Chris, they've, you know, both been reported to be suffering from Alzheimer's in later years, which is a real shame, and you know, it obviously blighted the end of his life. But yeah, as a player, he did a great job for us, and he was one of Lauren McMenemy's golden oldie signings that did really well for us for that period of time.
And as a manager, Tom, that must have been, if you're the same sort of age as me, first visit to the Dell, probably sitting in the junior Saints, and Chris Nicholl was the manager, and we played some pretty good football that got people like you and I hooked on going to the club.
Yeah, it was lucky we joined then rather than when Brantford came in afterwards, wasn't it, to replace him in many ways. But you're right, yeah, for a young kid, it was great. You're standing up on the Milton Road end, I think, with on the little stool I had then, and yeah, you had the Wallace brothers ride out, didn't you? Sort of, and some real characters as well. Even people like sort of Neil Ruddock. I remember one of my first games was when he scored the penalty. I think we beat Newcastle 1-0 in an awful game, but like a relegation scrap that we became really used to. And yeah, he was obviously, you know, had that sort of way of getting a real culture about the place, didn't it? And you know, it genuinely was a place people kind of often hated to come then, wasn't it, the Dell? So I think he must have been a fun manager to play for, I think. And yeah, it's really sad news. I think Jeremy Wilson, who worked at the Echo for a good while, and is working at the Telegraph, he's done a lot of work on the kind of, you know, how prevalent it is, sort of footballers, particularly centre halves, as Glen was saying, sort of suffering with dementia and things. And it's sadly, it seems sort of really widespread, doesn't it? But yeah, good memories of Chris Nicholl for sure.
And to be a manager for 6 years, Steve, that doesn't happen these days, does it? And he had some players at his disposal back in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s.
He did, and he was. We were probably a little bit unlucky that period was obviously the years where English football was kind of pariah state in Europe, where we were banned from European competition and stuff. Because you kind of fancy that if we'd had that kind of the carrot dangled of being able to play in European competition, then maybe we might have in that. I think that one, the best season under him, I think we finished 7th. I mean, I don't think that would have qualified us that year, but maybe you're then pushing a little bit harder at the back end of that season to finish a little bit higher, and then yeah, Europe could have seen the attacking talent that we had on display most weeks. But yeah, I mean, Nicholl was slightly before my time. Unfortunately, my first game was under Ian Bramford. So yeah, I was set up a very low bar of expectation to begin with. But yeah, certainly beforehand, the Nicholl years were interesting from sort of all reports and stuff. I mean, obviously everyone refers back to that Liverpool game where we gave them an absolute hiding at the Dell. 4-1 could have been 14 by all accounts, and that was kind of probably the peak of Saints football through. I mean, obviously, I know we were pretty successful in the early 80s in terms of league positions and stuff, but that was probably the peak in terms of an individual match performance. I think there's very few other games that are referenced as much as that specific game is looking back. So yeah, I mean, he's obviously got a sort of imprint on the football club and a lasting legacy.
And just finally, Glenn, what were the standout games for you? I mean, Steve mentioned the Liverpool game, but he certainly used to go for it, didn't he? You know, he had the young attacking players, and he wasn't afraid to use them.
I mean, that game you're talking about, and that season when we finished 7th, that wasn't really the norm until it happened. Because the first sort of 3 or 4 seasons he'd been manager, we finished sort of mid-table between 12th and 14th, but had never been really in danger of going down. So, and he had a tough act to follow. You know, with Laurent McMenemy having been there so long, and he had to regenerate the team and all this sort of stuff. And then we arrived at that particular season, and suddenly he had Letitia, Wallace, Shearer all coming through the academy at the same time. And I just remember an interview with him where he just said, well, it's against my nature, but we've got all these young attacking players. They're all good enough. So I'm going to play them all. And we played sort of 4-2-4 and more than one individual game. I just remember it was like a throwback to those early 80s sides under Laurie, where we just went for it. And yeah, we picked up some beatings, but then we win 6-3 the following week and things like that. There was a game against Luton that we won 6-3 that I do particularly remember, where I remember Shearer and Rideout scoring 2 in that game, I think. And, you know, might be getting confused with other games. It's a long time ago. Yeah. But no, it's just that the general feeling around that season was great. And the following season we struggled a little bit, and he was a bit of a victim of his own success, I think. I think expectations were raised by finishing 7th the previous season. And everyone thought all these young players are going to be 1 year older and 1 year better. But as quite often happens, second season syndrome sort of sets in a little bit, and it was a little bit more of a challenge that year. And of course we replaced him with Ian Branfoot, which was a great decision all round. So no, I think, you know, overall when you sit down and look at the overall history of Southampton Football Club, he's a very important figure in it.
Yeah, some wonderful tributes being paid today as well, following the sad news that former player and manager Chris Nicholl has passed away.